Thanks everyone for coming. I'm aware that I'm in a slot that I normally really struggle with, which is the afternoon slot in a warm room just before the opportunity to recaffeinate. So I will try and be as lively as possible. Also, I'm talking about something that is a little bit of a shift from the kinds of things we've been talking about this afternoon. So hopefully that will refresh everyone just to think about something slightly different. My name's Kate Gasson. I work in the research evaluation team at Elsevier. I'm based in the Oxford office, and I'm part of the International Centre for the Study of Research, and I'm going to talk about a report that we've released recently. For those of you who didn't make it to Stephanie Faulkner's talk earlier, just very briefly introduce the International Centre for the Study of Research, which I will stop saying now because there's only so many times I can say it without tripping over myself, and call it the ICSR. This is a group that we established earlier this year to work on broad questions around research evaluation, recognising our role as a custodian of the science process, and that we have a responsibility to encourage and co-develop responsible research evaluation practices. And when I say co-develop, we've really built that into the centre from the start by recruiting an external advisory board of an international and very diverse mixture of experts in research metrics, research indicators and research assessment processes. And so the part I'm going to talk to you about today are some short reports that we are releasing now, and I'll link to the website later, in case you want to check them out. A series of white papers on broad topics around research evaluation questions. So this is the question that I started thinking about when I was writing this report about fractional authorship. And the question is, we all know that there's been a huge amount of growth in scholarly publications, but how exactly has that happened? Is it just a simple consequence of the fact that there's more money going into the research system, therefore there's more authors, and so those authors are just producing more content? That would be really simple. Or perhaps we could envisage that as there's more technology available, we've been hearing about various kinds today, are researchers able to be more efficient, and therefore each researcher can produce more research themselves. Or, we can envisage that it's a more complicated mixture of things. We know that authors are collaborating more. They do that for various reasons. We know that the citation impact, of studies which have an internationally diverse list of authors tends to be higher. They're more impactful in terms of citations. We also know that people collaborate to get access to things that they don't have, whether that's the knowledge of their collaborators or whether it's resources, labs, field sites, etc. We also know that authors are under a huge amount of pressure in terms of their career pressures and in terms of grant funding to publish more. So people tend to just call this the pressure to publish. So are authors engaging in collaboration practices just to try and publish more stuff, to make themselves more successful? We can also think about this in terms of a research evaluation sense, right? So when we're measuring the total output of authors, we're trying to think about author productivity often. But what's complicating the way that we interpret that is that author practices are changing. We're seeing more and more authors listed on papers. A colleague sent me this example last week from a 1979 study that thought it was noteworthy to mention that while it was rare, there were extreme cases in the literature where there were more than 10 authors on a paper. We've come a long way since then. So if I show you how this looks in Scopus now, here I've taken the average number of authors per paper from 2008 to 2017, and that you can see that in 2008 we were expecting about 4 authors on each paper, but in 2017 that's gone up to 5 authors. Part of that has been driven by some extreme cases. Some people call these hyper-authorship papers. So here I've shown per year the number of publications with more than 100 authors. And you'll see that 2012 really stands out. That's purely to do with physics. So if I take physics out of the analysis, that bump disappears. And you'll see in some of the figures I show later, there's always a little bit of a bounce in 2012. Those physics papers I mentioned are primarily due to the CERN collaboration. and the Large Hadron Collider. So I just wanted to put up an example here. I hope you can see it. This is the Scopus record for one of the more prominent papers that's come out of the CERN collaboration. And I've just taken a screenshot of all of the authors listed. You'll see that to fit this on my slide today, I couldn't even get through all of the authors whose surname began with B. So there's many, many more. So this really complicates matters. When we're trying to think about say I'm an institution and I want to assess the contribution of my researchers to this, how do I understand that? We have one approach which is called fractional counting, where you would assign each institution 1 over the number of authors on that paper, if they had 1 author on it, or 2 over the number of authors on the paper if they had 2 authors on it, etc. But that doesn't necessarily capture everything that an author's contributed. So this is the data set that I've used, just very briefly. I used all publications in Scopus, which were articles, reviews, or conference proceedings, so everything that's most likely to be proper research content that's been peer-reviewed. And then for each publication, I look at the number of authors listed, and I call that the number of authorships. And then, because in Scopus we have this great trick where each author has an author profile that lists everything they've published, I can also look at the number of those author profiles that are active in any one year, and that I'm using to give me the count of unique authors per year. So here's the good stuff. So what we see over time is sorry, I'll just explain my chart a bit first. Along the x-axis, we've got publication year, and then up the y-axis, we've got count in millions. And then I've also indicated the CAGR, or the compound annual growth rate, across the period, just to give you an idea of how these different things are growing so that we can compare them. You'll see that, as I mentioned, the premise of my talk, publications are growing just over 3% over this period. We see that the number of unique authors is growing much faster than that. So this would seem to contradict the hypothesis that all we've done is put more money into the system, we've got more authors, so they're just churning out more stuff, because authors are growing faster than publications. We can see that authorships is growing even faster than that over time. So if you're trying to envisage what authorships means in this context, I like to think of it as the total length of all of the author lists on all of the publications in that year, because I find it a pleasing concept to imagine. So to try and understand that a bit better, I've then plotted these things as ratios so we can get a bit of an idea of how they're changing over time. So as I mentioned, because the growth of authors is outstripping the growth of publications, we see that each author is publishing slightly fewer publications overall. We see that, as I mentioned before, the number of authorships per publication is increasing. Author lists are getting longer. But the really interesting thing here is the line in orange in the middle. And we see that the number of authorships per author is increasing. So each author is appearing on more publications per year. So they are successfully meeting the pressure to publish by collaborating and by putting themselves on more papers. So this raises a question, really. If authors are collaborating more, there's more of them on each paper, they're producing less, we're seeing fewer publications per author, and they're getting increasing numbers of authorships, then does that mean that there's a productivity penalty to collaboration? And you can sort of see how that would happen, right? For each collaboration that you enter into, there's a certain amount of administration, a certain amount of overhead that takes up your time. That's time you can't spend doing research. It's also interesting for the system as a whole, if you think from the level of a funder, for example. It's interesting to know that this collaboration means that you're getting slightly fewer scholarly outputs per author. Of course, we can go back to my earlier point that when collaboration happens, those studies tend to be higher citation impact, for which I'm using as a shorthand proxy for quality. So it's then interesting to look at how this varies by field. I've already mentioned that physics is a bit of an oddball, so we can see how that looks for various different subject areas. Subject areas have very different traditions, I guess, in terms of authorship and how that's spread out. I will put the labels on here in a second, but you'll see that it gets very messy very quickly. What I've taken here is the high-level subject classification within Scopus that puts all journals within one or more of 27 different subject categories. And what we can see here is that for subject areas that have longer author lists, they have fewer publications per unique author. So that's sort of bottom right of the chart. If I then add the labels, you can see why I didn't do it earlier, you can see that in general what we have is STEM fields in the bottom right of the chart, where we very commonly see large collaborations, and then arts and humanities and social sciences at the top left. So in addition to my earlier observation about a productivity penalty to collaboration, what we can say is that that's happening, but it's impacting the various different fields in different ways. So circling back to the questions that I asked right at the top. Are we seeing more researchers producing more research? Yes. Part of the growth in scholarly publications is due to the increase in authors. But could we say that researchers are publishing more each when we look at the system as a whole? No, that's not true. What we see is that authors are responding to the pressure to publish by spreading themselves across more collaborations, more publications. But that because of what we perceive as an overhead of collaboration, that productivity penalty that I mentioned, that doesn't lead to more publications overall when we think about the number of authors in the system. So bringing it back to the kinds of things that you guys might be interested in, what does this mean for research evaluation? I started out by saying that we'd like to understand what the contribution of each author is. So we know that research output and total can be influenced by the amount of collaboration between authors. We see that by the variation between the different fields. For each individual author, this strategy is working out really well. They are enabling themselves, by collaborating, to appear on more publications. Happy days for everyone and the length of their CVs. However, the net effect of this, when we consider the system as a whole, is that we've slightly reduced the publication output per author. I mentioned earlier on with the CERN publication that there's something called a fractional counting method, where we assign a fraction of each paper to each institutional country represented on a paper. And so what I would suggest is that there is value to looking at full counting approaches and fractional counting approaches alongside each other, because they represent different aspects of research practice. And I would also mention that as author lists grow, understanding the contributions from each author just from that list is getting more and more challenging. This emphasizes the need for improved credit assignment, particularly for when we're evaluating research productivity. So some of you might have seen credit statements. This is credit with a camel case, capital C, capital T, I think. Where each author is asked to list which of various different types of contribution they made to a paper from a predefined list. And that's rolling out across more and more journals as more journals realize that they have a role to play here in asking authors to identify what they've contributed. And as we see that expand, I think that will be really, really useful for research evaluation purposes. So with that, I will let you go to coffee slightly early. And just leave you with some details of how you can keep up with ICSR and what we're doing, and where you can find this full report if you're interested. So please go to our website, sign up to our mailing list if you want to see what we've got coming out in the future. Follow us on Twitter, and if you'd like to chat to me about this research in particular, then please do ask questions now, or grab me at the coffee break, or get in touch. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kate, very much. Any questions? Yes.
So as a librarian, when I look at older publications that list collaboration, they never broke out however many people contributed. It would just say from the center of blah-de-da or the research study. So do you think that the data is maybe a little skewed because of that? That because it was never identified in the older publications who the individual authors were, you would just get whatever the name of the collaboration was?
That's a really interesting question, actually. And we'd need to look into the data behind that as to how many of those research collaborations were formally listing everyone. I think in my experience I used to look after journals as a publisher, and wherever possible people would ask to be listed out because they want the credit in terms of their Scopus profiles. But that's certainly something we could look into. It's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Yep, another one? No?
No, everyone just wants coffee.
Yeah. So I'll let you go to the coffee. So thank you very much for your contribution today, this morning and this afternoon. So hope you like it. Okay, so let's meet in the other room, in the other sessions. Thank you very much.
Thanks.